Our focus segment takes us to the U.S., which is bracing for an environmental disaster of a huge scale. The U.S. Coast Guard has revealed that 5 times as much oil as previously thought could be gushing from the blown-out well of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, which sank in the Gulf of Mexico last week. An estimated 5,000 barrels of oil a day are now pouring into the sea, and forecasters say a new weather front could push an already giant oil slick towards the coastline at an even faster rate. The state of Louisiana has asked for emergency assistance, as it now seems inevitable that Louisiana's coastline will be hit. At least 2 other states could also be affected. In a moment, we'll be speaking to John Hocevar of Greenpeace about the ecological consequences of this catastrophe, as well as our in-house environment specialist, Eve Irvine. But first, more on what could become one of the disastrous leaks in U.S. history.
It could be the worst oil spill in history. The oil rig that exploded last Tuesday before sinking 2 days later is leaking 800,000 litres of crude oil a day into the Gulf of Mexico. That's 8 times more than the initial estimate, and the resulting oil slick is around twice the size of Belgium. The rig's operator, BP, is desperately trying to seal off the leaking oil well.
We're still actively working to, as the Admiral constantly says, fight this offshore through a combination of our skimmers using dispersant.
Meanwhile, U.S. authorities are trying out a possible solution, setting fire to areas where the oil is highly concentrated. But some people question whether that'll work.
After a week in contact with seawater, oil becomes like an emulsion, with a gooey texture that doesn't burn well. What will still burn, and that's in very small quantities, will release dangerous cancer-causing chemicals.
Louisiana's coastal marshlands are a natural sanctuary for many seabirds. If and when the slick reaches the coast, it'll have a devastating effect on local wild and marine life.
Wetlands like this are much harder to depollute. With the canals and waterways, the oil spreads out everywhere.
An ecological disaster on this scale will have an immediate impact on business. 40% of seafood consumed in the United States comes from this coastline. Fishermen and oyster farmers could lose their livelihoods in an area barely recovering from Hurricane Katrina, which struck here 5 years ago. While it's still too early to measure the extent of the spill's impact on the environment, the Exxon Valdez oil catastrophe is still fresh in many people's minds. In 1989, a shipwrecked US oil tanker led to the worst oil slick in the country's history. Over 40 million litres of petrol was spilled off the coast of Alaska, killing 3/4 of the local wildlife. More than 20 years later, oil is still contaminating the area's ecosystem. The clock is ticking in Louisiana. If this leak isn't sealed off quickly, environmentalists fear it could be the worst oil spill in the country ever.
Well, joining us now for tonight's focus is our in-house health and environment specialist, Eve Irvine, and live from Washington, D.C. is John Hocevar, who's Oceans Campaign Director for Greenpeace. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Eve, let me start with you. How serious really is the situation on the Gulf Coast right now?
Well, right now, Foley, it's looking pretty bad. Much depends now on the winds. We heard today that actually 5 times as much oil is leaking out than we expected yesterday. US President Obama has declared it a disaster of national significance. That means they're willing to employ all means possible, even bring in the army to try and stem the tide and keep it away from Louisiana's fragile coast. It's now currently said to be about 15 miles from there, so it's getting very, very close. That coast particularly of interest, very rich in biodiversity. It's a wet marshland, and it's made up of a series of channels that are very difficult to navigate. Can only really get down them by a small boat. So if we get a lot of thick crude in there, it's going to be next to impossible to try and clear it out again. I mean, we have over 400 species of sea life blooming there. We have teeming with nesting birds. It's really an area of high significance for biodiversity, and it's even coming at a bad time for all the fish in that sea, as it's the reproduction period. So really not looking good, and all depends on the winds to see how far and how fast and how thick it's going to push that oil in.
Now, John Hocevar, so a pretty disastrous situation here. Are these spills very common?
Unfortunately, what we found is everywhere we have drilling offshore, we have spills eventually. So this is it's terrible to say it, but this is part of the human cost of oil. It's a disaster for people already. There have been several people missing and presumed dead, and it's going to be an enormous financial catastrophe with many fishermen and people in the tourism sector being severely impacted.
So are there natural defenses for the fauna and the flora against oil slicks such as this one?
The problem is that once the spill happens, you can do a little bit. You can recover, and the best of situation may be 15–20% of the oil, but it's almost never the best situation. In this case, I'd be very surprised if they were able to recover 5%. So in the end, they do things like dumping chemical dispersants to try to break it up into small particles, but that doesn't remove the oil from the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And in fact, yesterday they started lighting fires to try to remove some of the oil by burning it off.
So does that work? I mean, how can this be contained? You spoke just about emergency workers setting fire to a portion of the oil spill. Does this technique work? And isn't there a risk, perhaps, that this might cause more ecological disaster or even health problems?
There is definitely a risk of health problems and more environmental impacts, but unfortunately, once the spill happens, there are no really good solutions. The only good thing that you can do is prevent them in the first place. And, in the Gulf of Mexico, it's probably the one place on Earth where they're best prepared to deal with a spill like this, and it's still completely overwhelming them. Imagine what will happen if there's a spill like this in the U.S. Arctic, mm-hmm. Where drilling is slated to begin later this summer.
So, you talked about offshore drilling. Do you think this disaster will have an impact on President Obama's offshore drilling plans?
I sure hope it does. The decision to allow more drilling off of the U.S. coast really seemed like it was based more on politics than good policy to begin with. So hopefully this will be a wake-up call, and we can learn from this mistake before we repeat it.
Now, Eve, let me turn to you. We talked about the ways to contain this. Isn't there really no way to contain this disaster?
It's pretty difficult, Foley. I mean, and a lot of the ways that we try and contain it are still quite experimental. I mean, we've seen a few measures been put in place already, notably this chemical dispersants. We've seen 76,000 gallons of chemicals sprayed onto this oil slick. That basically breaks it up into tiny oil droplets, which means it's diluted quicker. But you are adding a pollutant to the sea, right. And it really deals a lot with, it doesn't get rid of the amount of oil, it just spreads it around a bit. We've also seen a variety of measures proposed now. One was used after Hurricane Katrina back in 2004, and it's basically like putting a big dome-like cap over the actual leak, that 1,500 meters under the sea, to suck it back up to a boat on the surface to kind of contain the oil in that way. But again, it's experimental. It's been used once in shallow waters, and it would take about a month to put in place.
John Hocevar, if there was someone to blame for this disaster, who would it be? There are mounting questions about BP's response and level of responsibility in this disaster.
Well, again, I think there's only so much you can do once the accident takes place. So really, the responsibility needs to be put on the policy end, the people that allow something like this to move forward in the first place, and certainly to an extent on the companies, BP and others, many of which fought against some of the regulations that could have prevented an accident like this.
All right. And so, Eve Irvine, last question to you. If this spreads, as it's feared, to other U.S. States such as Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama as well, what's at stake here?
I don't even want to think, to be honest. I mean, we have so many nature reserves dotting all along that coast. The area is known for its pristine beaches. It attracts thousands of tourists every year. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, we've seen when it gets stuck on. I mean, when you get that kind of crude oil stuck on birds, for example, they lose their waterproof ability, and that's why they die. They don't manage to keep their temperatures. We're being told at the moment that it could take up to 90 days to put an actual new relief valve to stop this leak. So we could see, I mean, we saw in Alaska back in 1989, we saw 3/4 of the wildlife there die because of an oil slick. So let's hope that we've learnt and we're not going to see such a disaster this time.
All right, thank you very much, Eve Irvine. John Hocevar of Greenpeace, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. That's the Focus on France 24. More news coming up very shortly. Stay with us.
A massive undertaking, 186 countries represented, 100 million visitors expected. Shanghai hosts the 2010 World Expo. As with the Beijing Olympics, China flexes its muscles with the biggest ever expo. France 24 brings you live coverage of this landmark event dedicated to the city of the future. For behind-the-scenes coverage of the French Pavilion with a window on French culture and savoir-faire, don't miss the World Expo Shanghai on France 24.